The past couple of years, Square Enix has released a number of video games, with a lot of these games being in their AA tier, and they released them back to back. Games like Triangle Strategy, Voice of Cards, Valkyrie Elysium, Stranger of Paradise, Final Fantasy Origin, Star Ocean: The Divine Force, the list goes on and on and on. Sometimes multiple of these titles are being released back to back even, and while some of these titles are fan favorites, a lot of them have not performed too well at all, both in terms of critical reception and sales. This is something that Kiryu-san, the new CEO, has recognized and is trying to fix. Square Enix makes a ton of games, but many of those games are not huge successes, and ultimately a large number of them end up being another Forspoken or another Foam Stars. Titles that everyone can see from a mile away are going to fail at launch, and yet are still sent to their death march. Well, today we got some news that at first I thought was incredibly bad, and a lot of people on social media are certainly spinning it that way. And while it definitely is going to have its downsides, I think it's also one of the best decisions that Square Enix can make, and sends a good signal to me that this new CEO is not going to lead things down the same path that Matsuda did. So please go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Guys, we are so close to 97,000. Please go ahead and push us over the edge as we aim for 100,000 subscribers by the end of the year. Square Enix has recently announced they are going to be taking a $140 million hit for their content abandonment losses. In other words, they just canceled 22 billion yen worth of video games. This includes both PC and console game development. So these are HD games and not mobile games, not MMOs. So a ton of games are canceled, and we likely will never even know which ones unless it was something that was already announced. But as always, before we get into the analysis of things, I want to read the objective information to help you decide what's going on for yourself. Today, Square Enix released this statement. Square Enix Holdings expects to recognize extraordinary losses pertaining to abandonment losses associated with its content production account on its books for the fiscal year ended in March 2024 as detailed below. Nature of the extraordinary losses. At the meeting convened on March 27, 2024, the board of directors of Square Enix Holdings voted, in light of the myriad changes underway in the environment surrounding its group, to revise the group's approach to the development of high-definition games, with the intention of being more selective and focused in the allocation of development resources. As a result of a close examination of the group's development pipeline, undertaken in keeping with this revised approach, the company expects to recognize approximately 22.1 billion yen in content abandonment losses on its books for the fiscal year ended March 2024. Outlook. The company is carefully reviewing its consolidated forecast for the fiscal year ended in March 2024 to assess the potential for impact from the above or other factors. Should revisions to its forecast prove necessary, the company will promptly disclose the same. On one hand, this is unfortunate because in that $140 million worth of losses, I'm sure there are a ton of games in there that you and I both would have wanted to play. That being said, there is also probably a number of titles in there that nobody wanted to play. Yet another Babylon's Fall. Unfortunately, this also means that a lot of the more awesome games that Square Enix made during that time period, such as Neo Twiwi, are probably not getting another game. I hope that statement ages bad, as I would love to see that series continue. However, for every hidden gem like Neo, there were a ton of other lackluster games that were released. And while these AA games don't cost nearly as much to develop as any of the AAA games, many of them still aren't really bringing in the money in order to justify their existence. For example, I know many Final Fantasy fans love Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin. However, the sales of that game were not particularly strong, with it being the fourth lowest debut for a Final Fantasy spin-off in Japan, selling only 46,000 physical copies in its first week. But at least that title managed to be a fan favorite. Whenever you look at titles like Forspoken or Foam Stars or Babylon's Fall or Avengers or Chocobo GP, these games are met not only with very mixed or outright negative reception, most of them weren't even titles that were beloved by fans at all. This is unfortunate in a way because Square was a big publisher of AA games, whereas now AA games are slowly dying in favor of AAA games and indie games, and this is something that Kiryu has commented on before. When asked, why have you been unable to slim your lineup down until now? As our customers' needs and the types of devices have diversified, we have tried to produce hits by developing a wide variety of titles, rather than by focusing only on certain ones. I believe this has resulted in the splintering of our resource pool. Meanwhile, there have been clear winners and losers among the major titles released recently in the gaming market, and it has become possible even for indies to make their presence felt. The market is increasingly polarized between blockbuster and indie titles, but I feel that we have developed many titles that fell somewhere in the middle. I want to make clearer distinctions going forward. Then of course there is allocating resources as well, because not all of these games are AA. Some of them are in fact AAA in budget, like Forspoken, or like Avengers or Babylon. However, this is what Kiryu meant when he talked about being more selective on their resources, putting money into titles that you have faith in and know will succeed, and then really focus on marketing and getting the word out. Of course, there is also concern about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and Final Fantasy XVI, and how the sales of those games have been going. Currently, we don't know exactly how much Final Fantasy VII Rebirth has sold. Final Fantasy XVI is still currently posted at around 3 million, with no sales update in sight. However, with the PC version of Final Fantasy XVI planned, it's safe to assume we'll be getting an update somewhere around then, though I would imagine the title is somewhere close to around 5 million. The current concern is that there seems to be a downward trend in Final Fantasy sales. I don't think by any means that either of those games failed. In fact, I both think they did relatively well. However, what's definitely clear is that recent Final Fantasy games aren't breaking any sales records. FF as a series isn't growing in quite the same way you'd imagine. I mean, take Resident Evil for example. The original Resident Evil 2 sold around 5 million units, and Resident Evil 2 Remake sold over 13 million units as of October of 2023, over double and close to triple the sales of the original game, which is a clear indication of just how much Resident Evil has grown. That was the result of one of Resident Evil's most popular games getting remade, and then with Final Fantasy VII, the original sold around 14 million units, and Final Fantasy VII Remake has sold around 7. 7 million is still a really good number, and they did certainly profit on that game. However, it's quite clear to see that FF isn't exactly growing in popularity, and certainly that is one of the major issues that's facing Square Enix. Of the games that were cancelled, I don't think any of them were major Final Fantasy titles. The idea that some people are afraid that Final Fantasy IX Remake got cancelled or Final Fantasy Tactics Remake or anything like that, I think that those are the titles that are still alive, because Final Fantasy as a brand name does still sell pretty well, even if it's not significantly reaching a brand new audience in a big way. I also don't think any larger Dragon Quest titles or anything like that have been cancelled. But do I think that Various Day Life 2 was probably cancelled behind the scenes? Yeah, you can believe it. I think ultimately that the benefit of this, and why this is honestly good news at the end of the day, is that instead of Square Enix just putting out a ton of titles in the way they did in 2022 and 23, they are going to focus on making quality games that sell to people, games that people care about, and that will review well, and ultimately sell well and be cared about by fans. I really couldn't help but think during that era where they were just putting out games every week, for every 5 of these games that have terrible reviews, don't really sell well, and nobody cares about, you could have consolidated all of that budget into making a higher end game that more people were going to care about. And it seems abundantly clear to me that Kiryu notices the same thing as well. All of the money spent on foam stars would have been better spent if it was on marketing Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. So while it may be bad news in the short term, I can't help but think in the long term that while yes, unfortunately some games that people were probably looking forward to have gotten cancelled, Square Enix wanting to prioritize quality over quantity is ultimately a great decision, and one that is ironically going to allow them to produce more high quality games than ever. Theoretically. This is something that I'm really eager to hear everyone's thoughts on in the comments below, so please leave a comment as I'll definitely be reading them. And I will see you all in the next video.